Crayon to CAD is a book that I never intended to write. I started my career at Holden in 1968 as a junior cadet designer, and in those days, a bit like Norm, I walked the passages and corridors of Holden, rubbing shoulders with the people that Norm showed earlier, the people who designed the first Holden. I was young, I was naive, I was too busy worrying about myself to actually sit down and talk with those people about what they did in that era to generate the product that became the Holden car. It's now 2018 and the manufacturing industry in Australia is no longer with us. When I finished my career full-time in 2013, I came to realise that nobody had written a book on this subject, and therefore I decided, while I had the motivation to do it, and to be frank, while a lot of the people I wanted to meet and interview were still alive, to actually put their story into a book. The book Crayon to CAD is all about the people and the places and the way cars are designed. It's quite a different approach to the approach Norm has taken and the successful outcome of Norm's book. I decided to self-publish the book because I was selfish enough to believe that I knew what I wanted and I sort of could capture the essence of the story. So effectively, I start in many ways at the point Norm finishes. I start at the point where I can recognise the people, I remember them from the start of my career, and many of them now who are in their late 80s and 90s were able to contribute to the book. There are extensive interviews and biographies of over 20 people that were part of the motor industry, and it was really important for me to ensure that I captured not only the companies I worked for like Holden, Nissan and Toyota, but I wanted to capture BMC Leyland, Chrysler of course, and some of the other manufacturers, including the early days of VW in Australia, some of the designs that were done locally, and to cover as much as I could about the local industry. Of course, the industry started with artists. This is the Crayon end of the beginning of the story. Many of them were commercial artists that were brought into the car companies, despite the engineers, to actually create style and image over the design of cars. They worked very much like draftsmen, as you can see here. Gentleman there, Jack Bergen, was with us at Holden in the 1970s, so he was a guy that came, like many of those other people that Norm showed, from Woodville in South Australia, moved across at Hartnett's bequest to actually develop the first Holden car. You can see there the very simple conditions they worked in, the fairly primitive conditions, often as an adjunct to the manufacturing areas. This is a design review in the early 1950s of the car that was ultimately going to become the 1956 Holden. Again, a more modern view. This is a view taken, as some of you will understand, in the late 60s, early 70s, when Holden was about to launch the HQ range. That photograph is a stage photograph, as many of them were in those days. The thing about design studios is they're the most confidential area within a car company. 99.9% of people who work in car companies don't get into a car studio. So in fact, what I've tried to do in the story is to open up those security doors and let people understand how things worked, the way clay models were made, the way sketches were done. Again, Ford studio here, the designers and modelers are preparing a Falcon for presentation. All the bits will be added progressively to that model, and within probably a day or so of that photograph being taken, it will have been in an outdoor auditorium. People like Nissan, many of you don't know, but Nissan had a vibrant design studio here at Clayton that operated up till the closure of the Nissan plant in the early 1990s. A lot of design work was done by Australians in Australia and Australians in Japan. And I can mention here now that my colleague Phil Smoot here, Phil and I worked on the first joint venture between Holden and Nissan, and he and I worked both in Australia and Japan together on projects. Typical designer of the 60s and 70s, again using felt pens, crayons, surrounded by the jumble of what an automotive designer wants, wheel trims, drawings in the background, creating sketches which will later go into the clay models. The more contemporary designer now working in the studio at Holden, surrounded again by computer equipment. You can see there the milling machine, measuring machines and the CAD terminals the designers work to. So a completely different work environment over a period of time, and certainly a more sophisticated work environment. Nevertheless, designers really start out with a piece of paper, often just putting sketches down on a piece of paper, loose ideas, in this case probably designing the front end of a small car for Ford Motor Company, and from those really loose sketches moving to here, full-size sketches. This is actually one done in around 1964 when Holden's Technical Centre was opened down here at Port Melbourne at Fisherman's Bend. The gentleman there is Don Brown, who was a commercial artist and cartoonist before he joined General Motors Holden. Large size tape, what we call tape drawings. These drawings were made from 3M flexible tape, and then they were rendered with little spray guns to create the image of the car. Often we'd do one or two of those a week. The designers would do that in a competitive situation, and one would ultimately be selected. Sketches of an early Holden coupe going back to 1965, again reflecting the image and style that Australia was trying to adopt on its own. It was trying to develop its own character, even though General Motors, Ford and Chrysler particularly, the three American companies, had moved in post-war, and they were really dictating the design themes that Australia, they believed Australia needed. Australians had our own view of what our country did need, and for many, many years Australian designers continued to be very influential on the pushing for an Indigenous design or Indigenous designs, very much as Hartnett had done originally when he pushed very strongly for the cars that you saw in Norm's book. So the transition from being a local industry to having one that was dictated by Detroit was very much based on collaboration between the Australian design teams and the American design teams. Of course, here, an example done locally here in Australia, a Toyota car to compete with the Commodore and Falcon. That was an early sketch of the Toyota Orion that became Toyota's most successful six-cylinder car. And that design ultimately was the prime Toyota sold in China and Southeast Asia. So the car that was created just down the road here in Port Melbourne became Toyota's best-selling car in China. And again, a beautiful sketch of the last model Falcon, or one of the concepts for the last model Falcon. That's a rendering done on Alias, but it can show you how we've moved forward in really virtual imagery in terms of sketching. In terms of the clay model, that's again an art form that continues to this day, even with virtual reality. Clay models, three-dimensional clay models. That's one of the early GTRX sports car that Holden wanted to produce and ultimately cancelled. A full-size clay model of a version of the Ford Fairlane, again in the Broadmeadows studio at Ford Motor Company. Again, that model, you can see there the tape lines on that model. That's undergoing continuous change. The surfaces are changing, the proportion of glass to body to all the lamps. They're firstly done in that sort of design theme, and then eventually they become more detailed. Not only exteriors but interior modelling. That's the rear quarter panel of a Ford Territory that's being modelled. And again, those modular parts, you can see the Daimler equipment behind. Those modules are eventually assembled together and they complete an interior. And again, while we're on the subject of Ford Territory, that's an early clay model of the Territory. You can see there are two different sides to that model, and that gives the management an ability to evaluate different concepts without having complete models. And again, they are finally and gradually rationalised into a finished design. The book also talks about cars that never happened. Here's an example by an American working very closely with Chrysler Australia on the early Charger. After the early Charger was such a success, Chrysler Australia looked very closely at doing that sort of coupe version of the Charger body. Unfortunately, the tooling and investment cost of that would have been much too expensive for the Australian market. The US didn't need it, it didn't like that sort of car at that stage, so it was a stillborn project. As was this car, which was one of the versions that Holden put together in terms of evaluating a competitor to the Commodore within its own organisation. I won't go into details about that, but that was what Holden saw as a full-size car. After the fuel crisis of the 1970s, it was looking at different versions of design that could be continued as a local product. The P82, which is an attempt, this was going to be the medium-sized car that sat alongside the P76 in the Zetland plant. And of course that was an advanced stage of design when Leyland went broke and the plant was closed in 1974. But again, the history of this design and the people who designed it were very important to the story of Australian automotive design development. I also talk about I guess the companies that were able to introduce their own product. I feature three. The Giacottolo here, which is an adaptation, a mid-engine V8 adaptation of a Alfa Romeo sports car. I go at great length to tell the story of Bill Buckle and the Buckle and Gogomobile business, and also Campbell Bolwell and the Bolwell sports car business. All of those people, individuals, self-financed, who made a very strong effort and a great impression on the Australian motoring scene through the 50s, the 60s and the 70s. Talk about the technology of the design. Again, this is a 5-metre screen down at Toyota in Port Melbourne. The designers there are creating new ideas for the front of the car. Those designs are linked with another screen and computer terminals in Nagoya, and the interface between what's happening in Melbourne and what's happening in Japan is clearly demonstrated on that sort of technology. That's being fed straight into computers. Those computers are creating the actual technical data from the designer images, and that's being transferred straight to Japan. Interior models. It's very important for designers to understand not only exterior design, but the interface between exterior and interior. In my own opinion, interior design is a lot harder to develop than exterior design. There are a lot more rules, there are a lot more compliances, there's a lot more ergonomics, of course, on the interior of the car, but it also has to consider very clearly the spatial environment and the visibility and other issues around design. And that's a model of the, I think, VT Commodore. And again, those parts are demountable, they can be moved, they can be replaced to get a very good understanding about overall design. Current designer environment is very much sketchpad, very much technical and very much immediate. The data created by that designer on the computer is immediately transferred. However, having said that, the importance of a clay model is still relevant in the design program, as is the sketching and ideas that really generate from the sketch pad. You can see in the background there a very, very early of a model of the Territory. There's also a chapter in Crayon to CAD on concept cars and show cars, why they exist, what purpose do they have in the manufacturing or design development cycle. Now, I feature a number of them. The Effigy, for example, bears no relationship to a production car that Holden will ever build, but it does demonstrate the passion and the history and the emotion around what it represents for the company. It's an outstanding design. It again was based on a platform from another car, but an outstanding example of Australian design and Australian fabrication. Very importantly, Holden particularly down here in Port Melbourne has a world-class fabrication facility, and that provides product all over the world to other companies. Then again, a bit of heritage, the old Sandman, again, a relatively low-cost program, usually like a marketing exercise to promote a particular event or activity or a low-volume vehicle. In the case of Toyota back in 2004, we created a show car using the ideas of 14 to 16-year-old kids, what their car of the future would be. This is back in 2004, 2005. And what they told us was it was all about interconnectivity and mobility, and really the car was designed very much like a mobile phone of the era, with the satin silver finish, with the blue glass through which images were reflected. The car, for example, has it doesn't have a regular license plate. It has the license holder. When the license holder's license goes into the ignition, the screen on the back shows that license number. So in fact, they immediately take responsibility for the drivability of the car. Yep, radical, but again, this had what was called Friend Finder in it, and that's really a modern version of GPS and other types of equipment. And more realistically, I guess, looking at pre-production cars, which will bear very close similarity to a car that will appear in the next year or two, in this case, the General Motors Chevrolet brand. And I think, John, that was built in Melbourne, wasn't it? Yep, okay, thank you. Very briefly, then there's a chapter on the future, and to tap into that, I use the resources of RMIT and Monash universities. Went really back to young people in doing transportation design, where they saw the future of transportation, and there's a range of ideas that they have. We were able to select between some of the tutors there. We were able to look at some of the ideas for the future. That was the overall direction the book took. I felt it was important to recognise those people who don't normally get recognised. They're usually behind the scenes. In the book itself, I interviewed over 20 people, and there are bios of 20 people. I interviewed probably 100 people, and I've collected the name of 700 design people that work in Australian design studios since 1946. So it hadn't been done before. I'm very proud of the outcome of the book, and I really have dedicated it to all those people who have contributed to what Australia's been about in the last 70 years. Thank you.